All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our fifth of six Fall into OBOB events. So I'm Julie, the events manager at Roundabout Books in Bend, Oregon. So if you're local to Bend, hi. If you're not, thank you so much for joining us. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started officially. You are all very familiar with Zoom, but I do want to remind everyone that since we're recording this, if you don't want to be recorded, simply turn off your video function. We'll still be able to hear you during the Q&A. And then we're recording it so that people can watch it later. And then if you have questions that you just need to put in the chat, go ahead and do that, and we'll get to them during the Q&A. And then during that portion, we'll also be able to unmute you so you can ask your questions directly to the author. One of the things we like to take this opportunity to with our bookstore is to acknowledge that in Bend, Oregon, we reside on the ancestral unceded land of the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs. In our immediate area are also the unceded lands of the Confederate Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Tribes of Grand Ronde. We really encourage everyone to learn more about the land you occupy and the story of its peoples. If you have any questions about books like that, your local independent bookstore and your local librarian are your best resources to find books about the land that you live on. So our next and final OBOB event is Thursday, November 10th with David Robertson, who will talk to us about the Barren Grounds. So if you're interested in that and not registered yet, just check out Eventbrite. Let's get to tonight's book. So a little bit about it, if you're not familiar. This is the book synopsis. The situation is getting dire for Jews in Poland on the eve of World War II. Esther's father has fled to Cuba, and she is the first one to join him. It's heartbreaking to be separated from her beloved sister, so Esther promises to write down everything that happens until they're reunited. And she does, recording both the good, the kindness of the Cuban people and her discovery of a valuable hidden talent, and the bad, the fact that Nazism has found a foothold even in Cuba. Esther's evocative letters are full of her appreciation for life and reveal a resourceful, determined girl with a rare ability to bring people together, all the while striving to get the rest of their family out of Poland before it's too late. Based on Ruth Behar's family history, this compelling story celebrates the resilience of the human spirit in the most challenging times. So a little bit more about our author. Ruth Behar, the Pura Belpré award-winning author of Lucky Broken Girl, was born in Havana, Cuba, grew up in New York, and has also lived in Spain and Mexico. In addition to writing for young people, her work includes poetry, memoir, and the acclaimed travel book, An Island Called Home, and Traveling Heavy, which explores her return journeys to Cuba and her search for home. She's joining us tonight from her home in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Ruth, thank you so much for being here tonight to talk to all of these wonderful students who are participating in the Oregon Battle of the Books.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm so honored that Letters from Cuba is part of the Oregon Battle of the Books. That's pretty amazing. So thank you for that. That's super exciting. It's so nice to see all of you here. Thank you for coming to this event. So I want to tell you a little bit of the background to Letters from Cuba. I'm going to show you just a couple of slides so you can see some images of Cuba and get a sense of my inspiration for this book. So let me go ahead and share my screen and be able to show you this. Here we go. How's that? So you can see the cover of the book. Perfect. And I love the cover. I don't know, we might want to talk about this later, but how a cover gets chosen for a book is a really interesting process. And the artist who made this cover, his name is John Parra. He's a really wonderful artist, and I'm so glad that he was the one that did the cover. And so you can see that a large part of the cover is the ocean, because it's about Esther crossing the ocean, coming all the way from Poland to Cuba. Up on the left is a little corner of Poland. Here is the ocean, and here is Havana with the lighthouse, some of the buildings that you'd see in Havana. And over here in the very bottom is the countryside, the palm trees, the land. And this is meaning to symbolize Agramonte, the town in the countryside where Esther goes to live. So it's a really perfect and beautiful cover for this book, which also exists in Spanish. So if any of you are learning Spanish or have friends who are, they can also read the book in Spanish, Cartas de Cuba. So the inspiration for the book, as you already know, is my grandmother Esther, and I wanted you to get to know her a little bit more. I was really close to my grandmother and my grandfather on my maternal side, on my mother's side of the family. And here I am as a little girl, still in Cuba with my grandmother and my grandfather. So I was very close to them. We lived right near each other, and I spent a lot of time with them. And you can see that from this picture. And then as they got older, when we left Cuba, we settled in New York. And then afterwards, my grandparents moved to Miami Beach to be close to the ocean and the sunshine. And so I spent a lot of time with them there when they were older and hearing their stories. And my grandmother was always making cookies, and my grandfather was washing the dishes. And he passed away first, and my grandmother lived many years afterwards. And so I got to spend a lot of time with her, hearing her stories about how she got from Poland to Cuba. And I was always so incredibly amazed by those stories. She came from a town in Poland called Goworowo. And so this is a little map of the town, an old map that she had. And just to show you this very long journey that she and many immigrants took from Europe to Cuba. They mostly came from Poland and Russia and Turkey to Cuba in the 1920s and 1930s, so about 100 years ago. And they went to Cuba because many wanted to come to the United States, but it was very difficult to get into the United States. But Cuba had opened its doors, and so many of these immigrants searching for home went to Cuba. And that's what happened with my family. So as you heard, my great-grandfather, her father, went to Cuba first to hopefully make some money and bring the rest of the family. Terrible things were starting to go on in Poland at that time. There was hunger, there was poverty, and there was growing hatred towards Jewish people. And so they knew they had to get out, but it was very difficult to get out. You had to be able to pay for steamship tickets and get across the water in a ship. So this was my grandmother as a young woman, and she was the first to go to Cuba. She was one of 7 children. I changed that in the book to 5 children, but she was the eldest, and she begged and begged and begged her father to let her go first. And he finally agreed, and she was the first of the children to go to Cuba. And she promised that she would help him bring all the other children and her mom and grandmother to Cuba. And so in real life, my grandmother did that. She helped to bring the family over to Cuba. And thanks to her, they were saved from the war that took place in Poland. And here they are reunited in this small town. They went to a small town in Cuba called Agramonte in the countryside. And in the front row, you see that's my grandmother in the white dress, her mother, my great-grandmother, who had stayed behind in Poland. And here's my great-grandfather, her father, that she worked with to help bring everybody to Cuba. And so they settled in a small town in the countryside, Agramonte, but they couldn't bring everybody to Cuba. And that's a story I always heard, that my grandmother's grandmother didn't want to leave Poland. She didn't want to leave her home. And sadly, she was one of the people that died in the war. And this picture hung in my grandparents' house. And this is how I learned the story of this grandmother's grandmother who stayed behind. So those were the things that I knew when I started writing this book. I didn't have that much information, but I knew those stories. And I decided to write a novel based on all of this to honor my grandmother, to honor her bravery. And thanks to her, the family survived. And I always thought that was so amazing. And she had been so brave to do that. So I wanted to transfer that courage that my grandmother had and that independence to this fictional girl in Letters from Cuba, whose name is Esther. I set the story in 1938, right on the eve of World War II, which begins in 1939. I made her a little younger than my grandmother was when she arrived in Cuba. She's 11 and about to turn 12. When she gets to Cuba, she's with her father in Agramonte. She's writing letters to her sister, and her big challenge, how is she going to help her father bring the rest of the family to Cuba. The clock is ticking. Hunger, poverty. The Nazis are spreading their hatred of the Jews. And she knows she's got to do something, but how is she going to help get the family out to safety? So that's what I knew I had to write about. And I had to figure this all out, figure out this puzzle. So what happened? I went to Cuba. I've done a lot of research in Cuba. And so I went to the town where they live, this small town in the countryside called Agramonte, and I met people there who had been studying the history of their own town, and they had old photographs of the town. So I got to see this is what the town looked like back at that time when my grandmother lived there. Here's another picture. It gives you a sense of what the town looked like, what Agramonte looked like back at that time. So that started to inspire me. And so I went to the town myself, and let's see, and here we go. And I got to see what the town looks like today. There are a lot of old cars in Cuba, old American cars, as you'll see here in this picture. But this picture was taken just a few years ago. This is what that town looks like today. And so that really helped to inspire me to see the place where she and the family had lived. And I learned a lot about the history of the town, that it was a town where they raised sugar, where they had sugar plantations, that enslaved Africans had been brought to work in the sugar cane from West Africa. And I learned about the sacred tree where they leave offerings at the bottom of the tree, and it's a tree that cries. I learned those stories when I was there. And I learned about the religion too, the religion that brings together saints from Catholicism and African saints, African Orishas. I learned about that. I learned about Saint Lazarus, very important saint in this part of Cuba, this beautiful altar that they have for Saint Lazarus every year. And I learned about the drums. You can see here in this picture, the drums are drummed on their sides. And I heard the drums being played there, and the drums were really amazing. So I knew that I was going to have to bring all of these things into my book. And I knew that there was a Chinese neighborhood in Havana, and I learned that there had been Chinese people in Agramonte as well. So I thought, well, I've got to incorporate that community, that culture as well into my book. And in Havana, in fact, there's a monument to the Chinese because many of them fought for the independence of Cuba over 100 years ago. And there's this monument, as you can see, in Spanish and Chinese. So I wanted to bring the Chinese people into my story as well. And then the Jewish community. This is a picture of one of the synagogues in Havana. And so a community developed of Jewish people in Havana too. So I wanted to incorporate that into my story. So how was I going to bring all these cultures and communities into the novel? Spanish, African, Chinese, and Jewish? Well, I started creating characters that would help me to show those cultures through the characters. So Esther learns a lot about Cuba from her friends and her neighbors. The doctor and his wife, Dr. Pablo and Senora Graciela, are important characters. She makes friends with a girl named Manuela, and Manuela has this very amazing grandmother, Ma Felipa. She makes friends with a boy named Francisco Chang and his uncle Juan Chang. They have a store, a general store in the town, and she gets to know two Jewish storekeepers as well in Havana, Rivka Rubenstein and Zvi Mandelbaum. So those characters helped me to bring to life this community. And then I had to think of, well, what is Esther going to do to bring her family over? And I thought about how the women in my family all liked to sew. They were very, very good at sewing dresses and fixing hems and so on. And I decided that it would be that through making dresses that she would help to bring her family. And speaking of covers of the book, this was one of the possible covers for the book because artists always design 2 or 3 covers, and then the editor and the publisher and the author and the artist, the artistic team, they all get together and decide which cover to use. So this was one of the alternate covers, and you see the dress here, and you see the letters, the palm tree, the sewing machine, some of the symbols, the thread here, and the pocket watch. You see some of the symbols that come up in the book. If you've read the book, these will all be familiar to you. So I thought, okay, she's going to sew dresses. She's going to help her father by making dresses and selling them. But she had to find a way to sell them to a lot of people. And I decided that the dresses would be sold at the fanciest department store that existed in Cuba at that time. It was called El Encanto, as you see here, the enchantment. And this store sold very elegant, very fancy clothing. And I decided that somehow Esther would end up selling her dresses here. And that's how she's going to get her family out of Cuba. And you can see what the store looked like, some of the research that I did to find out about these things at that time. And sadly, the store burned down in 1961. So it was a store that just existed at that time. So I had all of those elements together, and then I had to figure out, how am I going to write this book? And I knew it would be in Esther's voice. And I decided that it would be letters, that she would write letters to a sister that she loves, her younger sister, Malka. And these letters would be very, very magical. If she kept writing the letters, then her sister will have to come to Cuba one day and read them like a magnet. The letters are going to pull her to Esther, and they'll be reunited. And that's what I was thinking about as I was writing the book. I knew that my grandmother had written some letters, and definitely she had written some postcards, as you see here. This picture, the back of it was a postcard, and she had written some words here in the language of Yiddish. And so you can see she's sending actually this note to her father. And I thought, oh, okay, so maybe this will be an inspiration. And so that inspired me to tell the whole story as letters. And so Esther's writing these letters to Malka, like this letter where she's talking about the ocean. Now we're out in the high seas and there's nothing but water surrounding us. In the morning, the ocean is blue, in the afternoon, it is green, and in the evening, it is purple. And so she's writing these letters, and all of these experiences are being shared in the letters to her sister that she's writing and collecting them. So when her sister comes, they're going to sit together and read these letters and share these letters. So that's how I ended up writing the book. And I asked a translator to translate this letter you just saw. I asked a translator to translate it into Yiddish so I could see what it would look like in Yiddish, a language that I don't know, that wasn't passed on to me. But this is what it would have looked like in Yiddish, which is the language that Esther would have written in. And so I want to just leave you with a message from one of the letters that I think is important. Dear Malka, so many people are looking for a place to call home. I want to imagine that the world has a very large heart and can give all of us who have lost our homes a chance to start over. And I'll leave you with that. And thank you for listening. And I'd love to hear your questions, your thoughts, your comments, anything that you would like to know. Be very open to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, anybody who has questions, there's two ways to do it. You can put it in the chat window, or you can use the raised hand function in Zoom and I can unmute you. So if you have a question, let's go ahead and get started. If you're still thinking of your questions, I can ask a few. We'll just kind of keep the conversation going. I'll kind of start. How many letters do you have? Like, how many letters were there that you could use as reference?
Actual letters from the family. I didn't have that many, to be honest with you. I had those postcards. I had several of those postcards that several family members had written messages on the back. So I had those. And then I had memories of letters that my grandmother had mentioned to me or had read to me, but I didn't actually have the real letters. So this is very fictionalized. I really had to create the letters that weren't there. I wish I'd inherited, like a whole box of letters or something like that, but I didn't have it. I had a few just of those postcards, and the fact that everybody always talked about how important the letters were. But what's nice is there are history books that collect letters by immigrants. So I did read a lot of those letters. It's really wonderful that you can find that information. So I have read letters by all kinds of immigrants of different backgrounds going to the US. I didn't have letters to Cuba, written to immigrants by or in Cuba, but there were many letters from immigrants, Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants, and Jewish immigrants to the United States, and I read many of those letters just to see how people wrote letters back at that time.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. So let's go through those. So Leanna and Julia asked, was the other cover, the one that you showed, going to be in black and white or in color?
That's a good question. It would have been in color if we had used that cover. It would have been in color because the one that we used, we initially had a sketch in black and white as well. And it's really hard because artists come up with so many great covers and you
Mhm.
sort of want them all. And so it's really hard to choose. But everybody decided that the one that we went with was the best one, that it really just gave you the feeling of what the book was about, which is what a cover has to do. It's like it's got to like do so much. This one image has to really give you a sense of what the book is going to be about. So yeah, so it would have been in color. But that could be a fun project if any of you wanted to imagine a different cover for the book. I think that's always a fun thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Haley and Christina asked, do you have any other books that are similar to Letters from Cuba?
Aha. Oh, good question. Well, I have an earlier book called Lucky Broken Girl. Let's see if I have it. I have it here. Okay, perfect. This is my first novel was Lucky Broken Girl. So I wrote this and then I wrote Letters from Cuba. And so if you like Letters from Cuba and you want to read a different story, a more modern story, this one is inspired by something that happened to me. So this book is about a Cuban American girl growing up in New York, and she ends up in a car accident and has to be in a body cast for about a year and can't walk and has to be helped by her mom, and then she goes through a really hard time, very upset for a long time, and then finds a way to heal and finds a way to find hope through art and through writing and through storytelling. So that one is based on my story, but there is a grandmother character in Lucky Broken Girl that's also inspired by the same grandmother that I wrote about. So yeah, so that book I think you might also enjoy.
Yeah, that's very cool. So we have another question. Did it make you sad to write this story?
Yeah, it's a good question. Definitely, there were very sad moments when I was writing. I think a lot of us when we write, a lot of authors, we really get into the feeling and the emotions of our stories, and sometimes we cry when we're writing. I know I cry sometimes when I'm writing, and I'm in a very, a sad situation, telling a story that I know was sad. And I was sad because I knew that the grandmother wasn't going to make it, that she wasn't going to come to Cuba, because I wanted to follow, the truth of what happened in
Mhm.
my family. So I was sad knowing that she wasn't going to make it. So that made me sad. And then there were moments when I just worried for Esther. Was she going to make it? Was she going to be able to help save her family? How were things going to be for all of them? So there were definitely moments that I was like worried and sad for my characters, but then I also was able to find moments where it's like, no, she's going to be all right. This is challenging, but she's going to make it, and she's going to help bring as many of her family as she can. So Esther, was like, I was really rooting for her, that she was going to find a way to make things happen. So yes, I think when you're writing, you go through so many emotions. So you definitely have moments where you're really sad, but then you have moments when you're happy and you go, great, she's gonna do this. She's gonna figure this out. So it's a very exciting process to write. And
Yeah,
that's so exciting to share it with readers.
that's so great. Um, we have another question. Was Cuba at that time as integrated as it seemed in your book?
Wow, that's a good question. Yes, Cuba was very integrated by then, by the 30s. There was really a mix of these different communities, and that's one of the things I wanted to show. Sometimes you think of Cubans and you go, Cubans. But I wanted to show that, there's many different kinds of Cubans. They all think of themselves as Cubans, but they have these different backgrounds, these different histories. And so I wanted to show that there is that mix, that African Chinese,
Mm.
Jewish, Spanish Catholic mix as well. So I wanted to show all of that kind of coming together and people really coexisting and living together, as they did in this country town. And I got to experience it because I went there and I saw that coexisting, was real there. I got to observe it and to see it and to hang out with different kinds of people, and people were so welcoming. So yeah, I would say they were pretty well mixed at that time, and probably even more so now. But definitely at that time, that's very much a part of Cuba. There's an anthropologist named Fernando Ortiz who wrote about something that it's not the melting pot, but it's a different concept of mixture, which is called ajiaco. I should put it in the chat, because it's an interesting word. And ajiaco is this Cuban stew. And so it has all these like root vegetables and plantains and corn and all these different things are in that stew. And that's what he compared Cuba to, like a kind of stew. So not a melting pot exactly, but an ajiaco is a stew of all of these different people with different communities and cultures, but coexisting together.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That makes me think of that old book, Stone Soup, where everybody adds their ingredient and it just makes it even more delicious. Yeah, I
Yeah,
love
yeah.
that little book.
And nobody
Um,
loses their flavor. Like all the
yeah,
flavors are there,
and still
yeah, yeah.
taste them all. Yeah, that's great. Gosh, we have quite a few questions to get through. So here's one. I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, but which character you most alike?
That's a good question. They say that when you write a book as an author, you kind of become all of your characters, so there's a little bit of you in every character. You have to sort of imagine yourself being each character. So, probably in my case it would be Esther because she's my grandmother, but I loved Manuela. I mean, she becomes such a dear friend to Esther, and I loved Manuela a lot too. And then that grandmother, Ma Felipa, it was like, oh, I loved her, and I have recently become a grandmother myself, so I was like, I like this grandmother. I like the way she's a grandmother. So I was identifying with her. So I was identifying with, and even the male characters too, like, Juan Chang. I mean, he's like such a great, young man, and I'm the mother of a son, so I was like identifying with like him, like through my son, if that makes any sense. So you sort of find a way to feel for each of the characters, even the characters you don't like. You've still invented them, so they're sort of part of you in that sense, and you sort of have to get inside each of them to understand them, if that makes sense. So I guess there's a little bit of me in every single character, but there's some where there were more me than others, I guess I would say.
That's great. All right. So here's another one. Um, it says in the story, Esther got a letter from her mom, and underneath the mailing sticker, did that actually happen?
No, that didn't actually happen. That happens in the book. But that did not actually happen. Yeah. You have a lot of liberty when you're writing fiction to make things happen the way you would like them to happen or the way they might have happened, which is very different from when you're writing nonfiction, where you can't really take those liberties. You have to be accurate with the facts, and if you've done interviews with what people have told you. And I'm in addition to being a writer, for kids, I'm also an anthropologist. So I've spent a lot of time interviewing people and talking to people about their lives. And so when I write those stories, I can't make up something that didn't happen, but in fiction I can. So some things are a little bit magical, like what I would have liked to have happened or what might have happened.
That's interesting because I think a few of our guests tonight were on our event 2 weeks ago with Waka Brown for While I Was Away, which is the retelling of her time as a young girl going to Japan and sending letters back to her friends in the US. And she actually had some points where her editors were like, well, let's change this. And she's like, I can't. That's not what actually happened. Yours is the flip of these events actually happened, but you don't know the minor details. So you are having to create a little bit more. So someone else asked, did Esther actually get a pocket watch on the boat?
Aha,
So
right.
again, that might be something that you had to come up with because it helped your story, but you don't really know if it happened.
Exactly, exactly. Because I just had, the bare outlines of the story. Like I just knew that my grandmother was the first to go, that she begged to be the first to go to Cuba, that she went by herself, that she was young. Those are the things I know, and that her grandmother never came, and that just like left, a big hole in her heart. Like, oh my God, I didn't get my grandmother out, and that stayed with my grandmother. So that was what I knew, and then I had the pictures and a couple of other stories. But yeah, but the day-to-day details, like there were so many things I didn't know, like how did she learn Spanish, for example? How does a young girl, a young Jewish Polish girl arrive in Cuba? How do you learn Spanish? I was really curious about that. And I didn't know, I hadn't really asked her. I had some sense, because my grandmother was very studious. So I had some sense of how she might have learned Spanish because I did know how she had learned English. Because when we came to the United States, she would go to night school because she was very serious and she would work all day at a fabric store. And then at night, she'd go to night school and learn English. And I thought, so okay, so that's what she's like. So then in Cuba, I have her learning Spanish by reading the poetry of a major poet and independence leader, Jose Marti. She's reading these poems, and that's how she's learning Spanish. And I thought, well, this would be the way my grandmother would have learned Spanish, but I didn't actually know. So I had to really go from the few things I did know and then imagine the rest, right? So I had to imagine that. And then I had to imagine what would it be like to suddenly taste tropical fruits? If you come from Poland and suddenly you're trying, a mango or you're trying a pineapple, these are bananas, even these are fruits you've never had. And I remembered that my grandfather had said to me that when he first arrived in Cuba, and they didn't have a lot of money either, these immigrants, when they arrived, he said that all he ate was bread and bananas. And so that stayed with me. Oh, bread and bananas, pan y plátano, pan y plátano. And so I did put that in the story. And it's like the first thing that Esther tries, when she gets to Havana, when her father meets up with her, is banana and bread. So there were things like details like that, but I didn't have all the details. So the ones I didn't have, I had to create.
Yeah. Someone's wondering how long it took you to write letters from Cuba.
That's a great question. Definitely altogether took about 2 years, maybe, or so, 2, 3 years. I'm trying to remember when I started writing it and then when it was published, but it took about 2 years for sure to actually finish the writing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty standard, time frame too, because you have another job and a lot of things going on. I'm always amazed when people can get a book written, quickly because it takes a lot of work. Um,
Yeah, it
so
takes a lot of work, and I don't know, all the students you're here, if you're aware of revision, that you write one draft and then you go back over it and go, well, maybe this could be better, maybe I could give more detail here, maybe I don't need this part. So you add and you subtract, and then you work on the writing itself, and you chose a word that was good, but maybe you look at it again and go, maybe I have a stronger word here. Maybe I have a better sentence that I can write. So you go back and
yeah,
you try to make it as good as you can. So it's a process, and you have to be very patient with yourself too, because sometimes you can't get it all perfect from the beginning. You have to really go back and be patient with yourself and with the writing.
yeah. Well, I do see we have a hand raised, so let's let somebody ask a question in person. So Adeline, if you want to unmute yourself and ask it, go ahead. So, there you go.
So, saying you were Eduardo, he was like really mean to Esther. Would did your grandmother ever meet somebody like him?
Sort of. There definitely were one or two mean people in her experience. Not exactly like Senor Eduardo, but there were definitely some people that that had those ways of thinking at that time. So I did know that, and so I wanted to show that with one very strong character. So that's how Senor Eduardo was born. Because sadly, there were some people at that time that that were very against the Jewish migrants who were coming to Cuba, and I wanted to show that. And my grandmother did remember some of those experiences, though overall, most of the experiences that she had were very, very positive. She and other immigrants that came from Poland and other places to Cuba. She said that for her, Cuba was like a big breath of fresh air, that she suddenly felt like, wow, this is like such a tolerant and such a welcoming place. So she definitely felt happier overall getting to Cuba. But there were like one or two people that were not as nice as most people were.
That's a great question. Thank you. Let's see, we've got another one in the chat. Were the designs from the dresses based off of designs you know?
Ah, another good. I have so many good questions, everybody. Thank you. That's a good question. The one thing that was important to me with the designs, and some of them were designs that I had seen. I was interested in wraparound dresses. That was like one design that I thought, how you could make like a dress that would be beautiful, but also easy to sew and easy to wear, and that would work in Cuba. So I thought of the wraparound dress. But one thing that was important was that Esther, I thought of her as a very practical kind of person, and she wouldn't have wanted anything frilly or that would make it hard for her to move around. And I decided that she would have pockets in her dresses. So that was very important too, that there are pockets, so that if she needs to carry things like the pocket watch, she's got the pockets. So those were important things that I thought about with the dresses. At this time, most girls and women didn't wear pants. That was still very unusual in the 1930s. It was almost 100 years ago. And so I thought of having her make pants, but then I thought, no, I would stick to dresses because I know that's what they wore. But her dresses would be more practical. They wouldn't be frilly. They wouldn't be like overly decorated, but they would still be, beautiful dresses. So I had that in mind when I was writing. And I looked at dresses from that time period as well. That's another, I had forgotten actually that I did some research on that too, and looked up women's costumes and dresses at that time, and looked up what people were wearing in Cuba. And what was important, this was another thing that I thought of. I thought, what would it be like to come from Poland, from a very cold place in January, and it's freezing cold. You've got your boots, your wool stockings, your wool dress, you're trying to stay warm, and you've been on a boat for a few weeks, and that gets cold too. But then suddenly you're in a tropical country, like Cuba. And Cuba has, of course, these very, very light winters that are, winters are like in the 70s, and so I thought, what would it be like to suddenly arrive and, she's sweating in her woolen garments. So that would be like another thing that would propel her to try to find like a dress that would be comfortable and light and airy, and that would be flowing and, just allow her to be comfortable. So that's kind of too how the dresses were born. I was thinking about all those things that that were important too. That you've got to be comfortable in your clothes, and that's something that that I realize when I go to Cuba, that I never quite have the right garments, because living in Michigan, you don't need quite such light garments. Even you just have maybe a month or two in the summer where you really wear something very light. But in Cuba, that's pretty much all year. So I had to think about that as well.
That's a great question, and also such a great answer. We read so many books, and I think a lot of us forget what work can go in behind it. And I'm a book editor, and sometimes I want to say that to my authors. It's like, hey, you got to research this more, because it makes it so well-rounded when you've kind of thought about that, like the character even if it hadn't been your grandmother, if it was, just a character born out of your imagination, I just love that you make them so rounded that you really are thinking about what they would have worn in 1938.
Mm.
That's such, for anybody who's thinking about being a writer, you should write this stuff down, because this is great advice for just how to make a story really good. So we have a question about your other book. They're asking, how did it feel when writing Lucky Broken Girl?
Wow. Well, that was very emotional too, because that really happened to me. I was in this car accident with my family. I was in that body cast, and it was very painful and a hard experience to go through. And then I recovered. I didn't recover quickly, but I recovered. It took me like a year before I was really walking normally again. I had a very bad limp, and the family was convinced that I'd never walk normally again. So, I had kind of finally healed, and then I didn't really want to think about it anymore. It was like, okay, that was a tough time, when I was 9, 10 years old. Okay, let's let it go. But then the stories started coming back to me, and I started writing down like little pieces of the story, and I thought, and it was compelling me, and I said, okay, I'm going to write this, but it was hard because I had to relive that experience, and remembering what it was like not to be able to go outside, to be stuck in bed, to see my brother and my cousins like running around in the room playing ball, and I couldn't get up. I mean, there was just so much frustration, and it's so hard to be immobile. I don't know if any of you have ever been injured and not been able to move, but it's a really terrible experience. But then I thought, no, I've got to tell this story, because I'm sure, that kids will identify with this one way or another. We've all been through some hard times. And I just started writing that story, and it came back to me. And what was great about writing it was I realized, and this is what happens as you get older, that it wasn't just my story. All this time I had thought, oh, this happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to me. But as I wrote it, I realized that I was surrounded by people that were concerned about me and that were taking care of me. And that was my mother. So I realized I had to really recreate my mother, and what kind of mother was she at that time. She was this beautiful Cuban woman that just wanted to wear, her pretty clothes and her high-heeled shoes, and instead she had to take care of this invalid daughter. So I thought about my mother. I thought about my father, who was working 3 jobs at that time. We had just come from Cuba, and how difficult that would have been. I thought about my little brother, who would be like, what's going on here? Why can't my sister, get out of bed? So I had to think about each character, my grandparents, the neighbors, my best friend, Danielle, she's called in the book, another neighbor friend. And I thought, they all surrounded this girl who was me. And I realized that I wasn't just telling my own story, but the story of everybody around me, everybody that witnessed, this experience. So writing it became just a really beautiful experience of like bringing all of this back to life, like not just the girl in bed, but like everybody that surrounded her. And then she coming to realize that she was broken, but that she was also lucky, because she learned so much about herself, and her heart grows bigger during this time. She starts to think about other people who might be injured, other people who might be suffering, and she realizes that her heart has grown during this period. And so it's been really tough. She's been broken, but then she realizes that she's also lucky. So that was a great experience writing that book. I have to say, it made my heart bigger.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of questions that I'm going to do them a little bit out of order, because I really want to make sure we're focusing on letters from Cuba. But one of them is, how did you end up in the US?
How did we end up in the US? Well, we left Cuba. So there was a revolution that many of you may know about, a Cuban revolution that took place. You can look it up in 1959. And so most people thought this was a good thing. Fidel Castro was leading this revolution, and it seemed that the country was going to move in a better direction than it had up to that point. But then the revolution became a communist revolution, and there were many people that were against that. People who had a store or who owned anything like that, that was taken away from them, and they had to work for the government. And so a lot of people thought that was okay. There were a lot of people that were very poor and struggling and thought, okay, this is going to be better for me. But then there were other people who thought, no, this is going to be worse for me. And that's what my family thought. And so we left Cuba in the early 60s and went to New York. And I was 5 years old when I arrived in the United States. And we went to New York because my mother's older sister, my Aunt Sylvia, had married an American man from New York. And so they were living in New York. And so then when my family decided to leave, my parents, my grandparents, me and my brother were leaving with my parents. They decided to go to New York because that's where my Aunt Sylvia and my Uncle Bill were, and they knew how to do things in the United States. We didn't, and so we all moved to New York. And the whole family back at that time, they all resettled in New York. And you see this in Lucky Broken Girl. For several years, for a long time, when I was little, we all lived in the same apartment building. So it was kind of fun. We were on one floor, my grandparents were on another floor, and my aunt and uncle and cousins were on a different floor. So three different floors of this building. So it was kind of like we were all together and we'd run back and forth between the different houses. So yeah, so that's how we came to be in the United States.
That apartment setup sounds really fun. I would have loved that as a kid to have my grandparents just like a floor above or below. We have someone asking, is Esther's sister really named Malka?
No, that's a made up name. I only used Esther as my grandmother's real name, and I thought of using her sisters. She has several sisters, actually. I thought of using their real names, but then thought I wouldn't, that I would just keep them, anonymous, but create this one sister named Malka, who's sort of a fusion. She's a mix of her sisters, because she actually, in real life, she had, let me think, three sisters. Yeah. But I changed that in the book and made it just one.
Okay. And then someone is asking when your grandmother passed away.
Oh, she passed away in the year 2000, so
Oh, wow.
22 years ago. Yeah, yeah. But right near my desk, I have a little altar with pictures of my grandparents, and there's a picture of my grandmother there. In fact, it's that actual picture that I showed you of her in the kitchen with my grandfather. That's the picture I have on my altar that's right here to the right of my desk. Yeah, so it's been a while, but I think about her all the time. She was a big influence on me.
So someone asked if you did Battle of the Books when you were young, and I just wanted to remind everyone that Battle of the Books has only been around since 2006. So
Oh,
even when I was in school, we weren't doing it, and I would have loved that. I was a very big reader and a tiny bit competitive, and I would have been very competitive when it came to books. I was
yeah,
running
I
for
wish it had
sports.
existed. I wish it had existed when I was a kid. It definitely did not. And also, I mean, I don't know if you're all aware, well, you learned this in Lucky Broken Girl, that when we came to the United States, to New York, I didn't speak English yet. So I was, and this is before they had ESL classes and so on. So I was just like, okay, you're going to first grade and you have to figure out how to speak English. So that was very difficult. The first 2, 3 years were really, really, really rough. But I came to really love books, especially during that year that I was in the body cast, because my school from New York, my public school, sent a teacher to the house to teach me, and she would bring books, and that's when I fell in love with books, because I was so lonely and books were my company. So that was great, and my friends. So I read especially a lot of Nancy Drew mysteries during that year.
So did you speak more than Spanish? Did your family keep speaking? You said those letters were in Yiddish,
Mhm.
but did they speak Polish as well?
No, no. My grandparents spoke Yiddish with each other. They didn't really speak Polish. It was Yiddish that they kept. So I heard some Yiddish growing up, but I didn't really learn it because I would have learned it in Cuba, because was being sent to a school there that was Yiddish and Spanish.
Mm.
That was in Havana. but then we left. Then it was really Spanish that the family decided to keep. And so always in the family, we spoke Spanish. And then in public, we spoke English. And of course, in school, I learned English.
Yeah.
But at home, we always spoke Spanish. And to this day, fortunately, my parents are still alive in their late 80s. And we speak only Spanish to one another.
Wow.
It's the language of home. But if we need to speak English, if there's somebody with us who doesn't speak Spanish, then we'll move to English. But when it's just us, we speak Spanish. We really have held on to the language.
Yeah. That's quite the multiculturalism too. I mean, your heritage is Polish, but you born and raised, at least till 5 in Cuba, speaking Spanish, coming to the US. I mean, that's such, say that word again for me because I'm gonna get it wrong. The
The ajiaco.
ajiaco.
Yeah.
That's, so interesting. And I think so many American kids just don't have that, you know what I mean? Like that you just have so much different cultures coming into your life like that. We do have a question of if you're going to write another book.
Thank you for asking. Well, I have a few books coming out soon. First, there's a picture book coming out next year that I'm excited about that I co-wrote with my son, who I mentioned before. So that's very, very exciting. And it's called Pepita Meets Bebita. Pepita is a very sweet puppy, and Bebita is a very sweet baby. And at first they don't get along, but then they finally find their friendship. So that one's coming out next fall with my son Gabriel. So I'm very excited about that, to have written a book with my son. And then I'm just finishing up another middle grade novel. So that one hopefully will come out, if not next year, the year after, probably beginning of 2024. And that's really fun. That's 4 characters living in 4 different time periods. So that's a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun to write. So that one will be the next one. And that one is inspired by the story of my other grandmother, my father's mother. And that grandmother was from Turkey. So talk about mixtures.
Wow.
Another
Yeah.
mixture there. So I've been working on that one. So that should be finished pretty soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a couple questions I really want to get to before we end. So the first one I think will be kind of easy. Ryan's asking, how do you say letters from Cuba in Spanish?
Oh, of course. And I can hold up the book. Easier to see. Here you go, right? Yeah. Cartas de Cuba. You want to repeat after me?
Right? We should all do that. Well, I know that sometimes in their battles, they get asked to pronounce the words that are like non-English words. So thank you for that. Now we have it in recording. And then Adeline has one other one that I really do want to ask. And she's asking why you changed Esther's number of siblings from 7 to 5.
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, it's sort of a liberty that I took. I think I wanted the relationship with the sister to be so special that it would just be one sister. If she had several sisters, then I'd have to figure out, okay, all of these different relationships. So I thought thered be one very, very special sister, and then the 3 brothers. So yeah, so that was just a liberty that I took, and I thought, well, it's inspired by my grandmother, but it is a novel, so I can change things around. And yeah, and I made that decision. I did think about it a lot. I did keep the name of the brother, the oldest of the boys was Moshe. So I did keep his real name, actually.
Cool.
So that
Yeah.
was his actual name. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the questions we've got, and I love this because I think this goes into just so many fascinating things about publishing too, but did you originally write the book in Spanish or English?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, let me tell you this. I did write it in English, but the very first draft, a friend from Cuba was visiting Miami, and he's also a visual artist and a poet. And I told him I was writing this book, and he said, I really want to read it. and and I was writing it in English, and I said, "Okay, I'll translate it for you. I'll translate parts of it." And so I actually sat down, and as I was writing it, I was translating it into Spanish so he could read it, and which was very exciting because he liked it. And so I was writing. I don't know how I found the time and the energy to do it at that time, but somehow I did. I would write it and then I would translate it into Spanish. But it was kind of like a very quick translation. It wasn't like a perfectly polished
Yeah.
translation, but just so that he could follow what I was writing. And so I did, in that sense, write it in English and Spanish at the very beginning. And then when I revised it, then it was in English. And I might have done the translation myself, but I really wanted somebody that was an expert translator to do it. And it turned out really beautifully in Spanish. It's really beautiful to read.
Yeah, because a lot of books, you have to go through a process with your publishers, to kind of to get them translated. We've heard from some people in some of these events and just other events we've had for middle grade that they really want them to be available in other languages, but it can be quite the process. And that's what I think we need to kind of get over in some of the publishing is we need to start offering it not just in Spanish for Spanish speaking countries, but in Spanish for kids who are either learning it or more comfortable reading it that way or want to keep their heritage of being bilingual. We have a bilingual school here in Central Oregon, and it's one of the only ones, I think. It's out here in Redmond. But whenever we do book drives, we always try and make sure that we get a lot of bilingual or straight Spanish books because we have a big population, and we need to have more books that are translated. And then the last question, which for every author I think is like asking which of your kids you like more, but do you like Lucky Broken Girl or which one is your favorite, Lucky Broken Girl or Letters from Cuba?
That's a tough one. That is definitely like asking you to pick which of your children do you like better. That's a tough one. I like them both for different reasons. I mean, I like Lucky Broken Girl because it was the first one that I wrote in fiction, and and like I said, it's about me, things that happened to me, but then it's the whole family and the neighborhood and my, best friends. And it's like, so that one was like, there's so many people that I love, in that story or that inspired that story. So it's hard not to love Lucky Broken Girl. But on the other hand, Letters from Cuba, it's the inspiration of my grandmother who saved the family. And by saving the family, she saved me too, because I wouldn't have been born if she hadn't saved the whole family. So that's pretty amazing. And that story takes place in Cuba, and so it's very special as well. Cuba created a home for my family and so many others. So that's so special. And I love the characters in Letters from Cuba as well. They're more fictionalized than the characters in Lucky Broken Girl. But they're characters that I just, came to love. So it is really hard. I don't think I can choose between them. But one thing I can say is that each book I write, I try to make it better than the one before. So I keep trying to, okay, what can I do a little better this time or a little differently this time? So each book is a challenge, and each book I'm writing in a different way. Letters from Cuba, I had never written a book in the form of letters. And I thought, can I do this? Can I tell a whole story just through letters? So that was a great challenge. There are a few letters actually in Lucky Broken Girl too, but Lucky Broken Girl is just a girl telling her story basically. But with Letters from Cuba, it was like all letters. I had to make it work as letters. And now with the new novel that I'm writing, it's these four girls in four different time periods. And I'm thinking, how am I going to make this work? How are these four stories going to connect? So that's been a fun challenge. So each book has its own challenges, its own unique features. That's why it's hard, I think, for authors to choose one over another.
Yeah. Okay, so we got two things and then we are going to wrap it up. So we have one more question. And in real life, is Moshe older than Esther?
No, in real life, he was younger. He was about 2 years younger. That's why Esther said, I have to be the one to go
Wow.
because I am the oldest. But the great-grandfather, my great-grandfather, thought that she should go later because she's a girl. The big
Mm.
problem was that she was a girl, so he wanted one of the sons, even though younger, he wanted one of the sons to go because he thought one of the sons, Moshe especially, would be able to work harder than a
Mm.
girl could work. And so that's where Esther had to say, no, I'm
Right.
a girl, but I promise you, I'm going to work just as hard and I'm going to help you bring everybody. And so that
Oh,
was what she vowed. And
good
she,
for her.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So Adeline does want to know if you can pronounce a couple of names from the book for the battle. So Adeline, go ahead and unmute and ask those, and then we're going to wrap up after this.
So like how do you well, there's kind of two categories I want to learn how to pronounce, like her brothers and sisters, and then like all of her friends like Dr. Pablo and Quan Ching and that stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, there's, I mean, I don't know how much you're doing the accents, but it could be Dr. Pablo or it could be Doctor. It'd be Doctor Pablo. It could Senora Graciela. There's Manuela. There's Ma Felipa. There's Juan Chang. Who else? Oh, the brothers. Let me just be sure I've got them right. There's Moshe. At the beginning, in that first letter from December 2nd, 1937, there's Yolka, the baker. There's Zisela, the name of the cow. And then the brothers are Moshe, Eliezer, or Eliezer, I guess you could say, Eliezer, and Chaim. So I've got those characters. The name of the town in Poland is Goworowo, pretty much how it's spelled. Let me see. Are there others? Malka. Well, Malka,
And then what about Argamonte? Like
Yeah, good. Agra, Monte. Agra with a soft A, Monte.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks
Thank
for
you for that.
asking.
And if you check either the Oregon Battle of the Books Facebook group, or I'll send them out in the emails, but I'm going to send this recording to everybody. So just check your emails for that. So if you want to listen to another part of it or use it for your research for your battle, I'm sending it out. So, and then if you didn't get a chance to watch some of our other battle events like Life of Zarf or While I Was Away, those are all on the Roundabout Books YouTube channel. So you can find all of them if you go to YouTube. That's one of the things that I actually do appreciate with the pandemic is like we have so many recordings of events because of Zoom that I love going back and seeing how many views they've gotten, because they don't just have this one time, they're getting views over and over again. So yeah, if somebody that couldn't be here tonight and they're reading Letters from Cuba, make sure and let them know that they can watch this recording. And then as always, I just want to remind everybody to support your local independent bookstore. Wherever you live, your independent bookstore loves you and wants you to come in and buy books from them. So we will definitely be doing more of these in the future. Ruth, if you ever make it out this way, or when your new books come out, you want to do another virtual event with us, we would absolutely adore that. So thank you so much for making the time. I don't know if you guys realize this, she's 3 hours ahead of us. So it's getting a little bit late there in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So we're going to sign off. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank you all for being dedicated readers, because you are the future. And it's just makes me so happy to see kids excited about books. So thank you everybody so much for being here.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me. This was beautiful. Thank you for all your great questions. It was amazing. And thank you, Julie, for moderating everything so beautifully. Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right, everybody, have a great night. Happy reading and happy almost Halloween. All right, we'll sign off.